안녕하세요. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation to be with you today. I would also like to say that I feel very lucky. This is my second trip to Korea in less than 3 weeks. I was here just a few weeks ago, thanks to Terra Rosa Coffee, Better Coffee, and Ippy Co-op, who sponsored my visit just a few weeks ago. I worked for Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, now known as Keurig Green Mountain, for almost 27 years, and left the company towards the end of August thinking that I would take on just a few small projects. And about 2 weeks after I left, I was contacted by Lutheran World Relief and was offered a job to manage their coffee and cocoa relationships, a job that I just started actually just a few weeks ago. But the information that I would like to share with you today is really based upon my work at Keurig Green Mountain and the company itself. As you know, as we've learned today from almost every speaker, there are many challenges in the coffee world. What I'm going to share with you this afternoon is challenges that are faced by coffee farmers at the household level. As you know, coffee is grown in some of the most beautiful places in the world. It's grown in some of the most biologically diverse places in the world. It's grown in some of the most ethnically diverse places in the world. And it's grown in some of the poorest places in the world. There we go. This photo I took in Chiapas, Mexico. And you can see above this young woman a light bulb. This community had received electricity just the year before I visited. The building on the left, over here, was a communal kitchen where families were cooking over an open fire. But this is just one indication of the lives of many coffee farmers. But there's also, as we've heard today, the coffee farmer population is aging. In many parts of the world, the age of the average coffee farmer is well over 50 years old. Migration of young people is another huge issue in coffee farming communities. I live in the same state that Mark Pendergrast lives in, which is a very small state called Vermont, way up in the northeastern part of the United States, where it's very close to the Canadian border, where it's very cold, and it's a state that's very rural, where 15 years ago there were more cows than people. Many of the dairy farms in my state hire legal and illegal immigrants. A few weeks ago, I volunteered for an organization that is called Migrant Justice, that is helping immigrants, legal or illegal, have a better quality of life. And they had surveyed many of the local dairy farms in Vermont. And the day that I went to volunteer, I was asked to enter the surveys into a computer. And the surveys asked many questions about life on the dairy farm. But the thing that was striking to me is that every single survey that I entered into the computer, the worker, the illegal or legal migrant, had come from either Chiapas, Mexico, or Veracruz, Mexico. 2 coffee-producing regions, and this is no coincidence. As we heard, coffee pricing, the volatile prices, are also driving farmers from their land, among other influences. Climate change, we've heard much about today, and we will continue to hear much about in the future. This is a community called Nueva Colombia in the state of Chiapas. I visited this community in the fall of 2010 with a small film crew to interview coffee farmers. I'll talk about that film in a few minutes. This community is in a bowl, And to get to this community, we had to travel with a four-wheel drive vehicle up the only road that was open into the community. Normally, there were two roads that were open, but one of those roads had already been closed due to a mudslide. 2 weeks after we finished filming, Hurricane Matthew struck this community. It was a hurricane that did not hit the United States, so we didn't hear much about it, but it had a dramatic effect on this community. This is what it looked like after Hurricane Matthew hit. Devastating torrential rains, and I'm going to go back again so you can see what it looked like before and after the storm. These are forested lands. These aren't just fields that were washed out. It gives you some sense of the power of the rain that struck this community. The community members had to be evacuated by the Mexican government by helicopter because there was no way in or out of this community, and there wouldn't be for weeks. Rick spoke earlier about coffee rust disease and its impact on coffee communities, which continues to this day, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And here's a shot that I took 2 years ago in Guatemala, Santiago Atitlan, where you would pass by parcels of coffee that were skeletal, that looked just like this, and you can still see a few unripened cherries near the top of the trees that will never mature because there's no photosynthesis going on in this plant. This is having a devastating effect on farmers' yields and, of course, farmers' incomes. In 2010, Green Mountain Coffee Roasters sponsored a study that was undertaken by the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, known as CIAT. And they published the results in 2010. CIAT is part of the CGIAR network of agricultural research institutions around the world, which has access to over 60 meteorological sites where they could gather historical data, current data, and then begin to project into the future. And they made some assumptions in putting this together. The two primary assumptions were that human behavior is not going to change much between now and 2050, that we're all going to continue to drive cars, that we're going to continue to use appliances, that our lives are not going to radically change. The other assumption that they made, which may or may not be right, is that there will likely not be any new hybrid coffees that will be heat tolerant, that will make up the difference in productivity. Well, as you can see on the map on the left of Nicaragua, this is where, in the yellow area, is where coffee was grown in 2010. And on the right-hand side is where they project coffee will be grown in 2050. It's a reduction of 70% in land area. And they project that the coffee is going to be grown at higher and higher altitudes as each progressive year as the soil and the land begins to warm up. Because as you know, Arabica coffee does not like a lot of heat. And so the question now is going to be, what are the families who grow in sort of these marginal areas going to do? How are they going to continue to live? And is there a place for them in our industry? Green Mountain Coffee Roasters for many years had a policy of contributing 5% of its pre-tax earnings to support communities where it did business. About half of that funding was put to work in the United States, and it would support things like employee volunteerism, product donations, and small cash grants to community-based organizations. The other half was put to work in coffee communities. And in 2006, I took on the responsibility of that, overseeing those investments for the company. Prior to this time, I had done approximately 2.5 months of volunteer work in coffee communities, primarily in Honduras, but also in El Salvador, living with coffee farming families, living in their communities for months, And so when I started this new position in 2006, I thought that I had a pretty good idea of what life was like for small-scale coffee farmers and what their needs were. But before I wanted to start this new role, I asked the company to again involve SEAT to help us design a survey that could be used to interview small-scale coffee farmers to really get some data, not rely just on my own anecdotal experiences, but I wanted a broader set of data so that we could be sure that we were really addressing some of the critical needs. Well, I went with SEAT to Nicaragua. After Nicaragua, they continued on to Chiapas, Mexico, and to Veracruz, Mexico, and they went to 2 departments of Guatemala, Coban and Huehuetenango. And they used a questionnaire that had 22 questions that asked, basically it was divided into 3 sections. The first section was really about the family. It was basic family information, number of children, levels of education. Then it went on to information about the farm. How much land did the farmer have? What % of that was dedicated to coffee? What were farmers' earnings from coffee last year? What were the costs of production? And then it went on to questions about life. Had the farmer thought of doing something else other than growing coffee? Had the farmer thought about migrating? Had the farmer or his family or her family had any health problems in their family last year? And if so, what did they do about it? And did they have any periods of extreme scarcity of food in their household? And if so, what did they do about it? We interviewed farmers in their homes. We interviewed farmers in the field. And we interviewed farmers in small community co-op buildings. This was a photo actually of my first interview that I conducted, and it was in a very remote community co-op center. This building had no electricity. The only light in the building came in through the window. And I sat down to interview this farmer, this woman who was about 38 years old. And I started going through the questions. And the interview took about an hour. When I came to that last question around food security, this woman stopped. And she reached into her skirt and she pulled out the yellow cloth that you see in front of her, and she started wiping away her tears. And I thought, gee, I wonder, did I say something that offended her? I couldn't imagine what was causing her this discomfort. Well, she explained to me that she and her family had 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food in her household every year. And I thought, geez, I still thought, well, I guess this woman and her family have fallen on hard times. So we finished up the interview. I thanked her, and the next interviewee came in, who was a young man, about the same age. And we got to that last question, and he gave me exactly the same answer: 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food. Well, I soon learned that this phenomenon had a name called los meses flacos, or the thin months. Each country actually had its own name for this, as I learned. In Nicaragua, they also call it la vaca flaca, the thin cow. Well, all week long, we interviewed small-scale farming families these communities were hours apart. And I would have thought that they were calling on their cell phone to the nearest community, and they said, here's the answer to question number 22. It's 3 to 4 months, don't forget. But that wasn't the case. Every single family that I interviewed, hours away from each other, gave me exactly the same answer to that last question. They had 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food. This family that you see in front of you was the last family that I interviewed that week. Now, I was tired, but I needed to do one more interview. And the pickup truck dropped me off on a dirt road, and I walked down a gentle hillside to a very small, humble home at the bottom of the hill that was about 20 feet square, and it had wooden planks wooden boards, as you can see here. It had a tin roof, and I would have knocked on the door, but there was no door. So I knocked on the door frame. The father came to the door. I explained who I was, why I was there, and he invited me in. I started talking with him, and we started working on the interview. And there was a partition that ran right down the middle of this house, one partition. And I can only imagine that on the other side of this partition is where the family slept. And one by one, first his wife came around the corner, and one by one, each of his 4 children came around. We finished up the interview, we talked for a few more minutes, and then I said it was time to go, and I said goodbye. And I can remember walking up the hillside, back up to the dirt road where the pickup truck was going to return and pick me up again. Looking back, turning back, and looking back at the family they were huddled in their doorway. And I remember waving to them, and they waved back. And it was at that moment that it really hit me that this family could have been my family. It could have been your family. It could have been any of our families. It was really just the luck of the draw. And having a family who, like all the other families I'd interviewed that week, have 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food didn't feel right to me. I can remember the next morning sitting on the tarmac in Managua, looking out the plane window, thinking to myself, asking myself if I really wanted to stay in this business, in this industry. Because it just, again, this just did not feel right to me. Fortunately, by the time my plane got to Houston, where I was changing planes, I realized that perhaps in some small way, in my new role at Green Mountain, perhaps there's a way that I can begin to make a small difference just within our own supply chain by working with farming families to see if there's a way that we can overcome these months of food insecurity. Months later, 2 months later, SEAT came to Vermont, to Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, to present their final report. And I can remember when they presented this report, again, to me, the most striking finding were the results around food security, which you can see here. In total, there were 179 interviews conducted in Nicaragua, Mexico, and Guatemala. And 67% had between 3 and 8 months, the families had between 3 and 8 months of extreme scarcity of food. So again, I felt this was the area coming into this new role that my team needed to pay attention to. Because we realized that if farmers can't feed their families, they don't have resources, and they're not going to spend money on resources to feed their coffee plants. So the challenge with the thin months, there are a few challenges. The first is the thin months start in Central America about 3 months after the coffee harvest ends, generally in the month of May, when the farmers, many of the small-scale farmers' income from coffee is largely depleted. It's also the time when the rainy season begins. And it's also a time when the farmers' basic staples, corn and beans, the price begins to go up in the marketplace because the harvest doesn't come in until the autumn. So farming families who have most of them, surprisingly enough, do not have family gardens. They were relying on their income from coffee to buy food for their families. So here they are with very limited income left, with rising food prices every year. And so they had some survival strategies. The first strategy was to eat this exact same diet that they normally eat, but to consume less, consume fewer calories, eat less. The second was to eat less expensive foods that they don't necessarily want to eat, perhaps bananas and other products that are growing on their land. And then the third strategy was to borrow from friends, neighbors, relatives, or their co-op, and repay that debt during the following harvest. After learning about these months, I did two things, because many of the farmers, when we interviewed them, asked us, what are you going to do with this information? You know, we have people come through here all the time, and they ask us lots of questions, and we never see them again. And I told them that I don't know what we're going to do with the information, because we don't know what the information is yet, but when we have the results, we'll come back and we'll share it with you, and we'll talk about what the next steps might be. So fortunately, there's a university in New Hampshire called the Tuck School of Business, which is part of Dartmouth. A very good school. They supplied me with 4 graduate students who traveled with me to Nicaragua. They were bilingual, and we broke up into teams, and we had community meetings with the families who we had interviewed to share the results and to do a little brainstorming. And then I met with the co-op management. These were all part of a fair trade cooperative called Seco Cafen. And I met with the management of Seco Cafen, and I asked them, how serious was this problem? Because where I live in Vermont, where Mark lives, we have long winters, very long winters. And there certainly are people who enjoy skiing, who enjoy the winter, but I would say that there's a big piece of the population that by the time the end of February comes around, they've had enough, and they view winter as a major inconvenience. So I asked the co-op management if these months of food insecurity, was it just, to me it looked serious, but was it serious, or it was really just more of an inconvenience that families deal with, and it's just not that big an issue? And they said, no, it is serious. So what I asked them was, I said, if we arranged to have could we arrange to have a summit where we would ask someone, a neutral party, a researcher from SEAT, who could come and facilitate a meeting that would be attended by some of the farming families who were interviewed, by the management of Seco Cafen, some of the technical team from Seco Cafen, and also some local NGOs, with the goal of coming up with some strategies to overcome these thin months. And they said they loved that idea. So Green Mountain we decided to underwrite this, we called it a strategic summit. I went only as an observer. I didn't want to participate. This wasn't my place to participate, but I wanted to be there to watch. And so the SEAT researcher asked everyone in the room to please suggest some strategies to overcome these thin months, which he wrote down on a sheet of white easel paper. Once he had all of the strategies written down, he put it down on put the paper down on a table, drew some lines next to each suggestion, and put 100 coffee beans on the paper. And then he asked everyone to come around the table and to move the coffee beans to the strategies that they felt were the most effective and would have the most impact in dealing with this challenge. And he said, I love this, he said that this exercise isn't over until everyone is in agreement and everyone's happy. And so people would start to make a suggestion, and they would start to move the beans. And then someone else would reach in, and they would say, well, don't you think we need to do this first? Isn't this more important? And then someone else would say, no, this is more important. And this went on for about 40 minutes. But at the end of 40 minutes, the group had come up with 2 major strategies to overcome the thin months. The first strategy was to diversify the family's land. Again, most of the farmers that we interviewed had anywhere from 2 to 3 hectares of land, and virtually all of that land was in coffee. Very, very few of the farmers had any kind of a garden, even just a small kitchen garden. They were 100% reliant on coffee for income. So the first strategy was to diversify the family's land, to grow food that the family could consume during the thin months, but also food that they could sell into the local market as another source of income. The next strategy was to grow and store basic grains. So for those farmers that had a little bit more land, they could grow corn and beans, store these, and then use these to eat but also during if they didn't need everything that they'd grown, that they could sell some of this excess into the local market, again, as another source of income. Well, we began to use this model as funding projects. These are the types of projects that we decided that we would start to fund. But there was also another problem. Obviously, hunger in the Coffeelands is a serious issue, but the other issue was when I came back from doing these interviews with SEAT, I can remember calling a colleague in the coffee industry and telling him what I'd heard, one interview after another, that I'd heard. Every family told me they had 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food. This was someone in the industry who had traveled more than I had, who had been in the industry longer than I had, and he was stunned. He said, "You're kidding me." And I said, "No, I wish I was, but I'm not." I began to call other people in the industry. Again, people who had been in the industry as long as I had, who had traveled a lot, and to a person, they were taken back by this information. And so I realized that something that was so common in these coffee communities was either not known or not spoken about in the halls of the industry. So I asked the SCAA if I could present the SEAT findings at the next conference, and Rick and his team were kind enough to offer me that opportunity. And I presented these findings with another researcher named Chris Bacon, at that time from UC Santa Cruz, a university in California, who had done separate research on the same problem. And people, again, were taken back. The audience of about 100 people were taken back. And sometime that summer, after the SCA conference, I was again contacted by the SCA saying, "Gee, would you come back? The presentation that you gave was well received. Would you come back and update the information?" And I thought, gosh, I'd love to come back, but I didn't feel like updating the information would really move the needle. I felt what was really needed was something that would generate awareness of this issue in the industry. And so with a colleague at Green Mountain and a 2-man film crew, we went to Chiapas, Mexico, to that community that I showed you before, where the climate change had devastated the community. This was after our visit. And we went on to Nicaragua to interview farmers, to have them tell their story on film, but also to show solutions, because there are solutions to this challenge. And we produced a film called After the Harvest, which you can watch if you just search for After the Harvest on YouTube. You can find it's a 20-minute film. It's narrated by Susan Sarandon, and I think you may find it worthwhile to take a look at it. So the film premiered in Houston, Texas, at the Specialty Coffee Association Conference in 2011, at the symposium. And at the symposium, after the film, a few hours after the film, there was an opportunity to bring a breakout group together to talk about this issue of hunger in the Coffeelands. And of course, my hope was that people, after seeing the film, would want to do something. Well, I was way ahead of the crowd, and they needed as much time as I did to digest this new information. They were stunned, as stunned as I was when I first did the interviews. And then after leaving the conference, I thought, well, I bet somebody over the course of the summertime will call me and will say, "Hey, Rick, I have this idea. What do you think? Is there something maybe my company can do, or maybe we could do together?" And well, no one called. No one emailed. And I can remember feeling like we need to do something. So I picked up the phone, and I called a colleague at Starbucks, someone who actually I'd only met in a hallway. I'd been briefly introduced to this person just a few years before, but he was the only person who I knew at Starbucks who might be the right person to contact. And sure enough, he was. We had a great conversation. And I told him that I was thinking that maybe we could pull together a small group of companies in the industry to talk about this issue, but to more than talk about it, to see if we could work together to do something about it. And so in 2012, in February of 2012, 5 companies came together to talk about and decided actually to fund a project together in northern Nicaragua to begin to deal with this issue. And now, since that time, 2 additional organizations, S&D Coffee and the Specialty Coffee Association of America, have joined this coalition that is currently known as the Coffeelands Food Security Coalition. The good news is that the organization has hired a person who is really coordinating the group's activities, and the group has decided to become a 501c3 nonprofit organization in the United States, and soon, I believe, will likely be looking to increase the number of companies around the table, and likely will be bringing in the voices of consumers and perhaps NGOs as well to begin to deal not just with food security, but with some of the other issues that are facing farmers as we speak. And some of these challenges include access to health care, water for drip irrigation, and of course clean water for drinking, resources to diversify their farmers' sources of income, technical assistance. Certainly cooperatives, many of the larger cooperatives provide technical assistance, but frankly, it's rarely enough. Oftentimes co-ops of 2,000 members will have a technical team of 10 or 11 technicos who need to deal with every one of those farmers, and it's a huge task. Access to educational opportunities and employment opportunities for young people who are leaving. Many of them are leaving the coffee fields for the nearest urban center where they perceive there's greater opportunity. Access to clean water, and of course, as we touched on earlier today, access to credit. This is a photo of a project that Keurig Green Mountain sponsored in the mountains of Chiapas, Mexico. It's a Partners in Health is the name of the organization. And they have taken over, with the approval of the Mexican government, just a few community medical clinics that are very, very isolated. In the past, these clinics were manned by a nurse who would come to the clinic and open it just a few days a week. Oftentimes, the medicine cabinet in these clinics was next to bare. And now, thanks to Partners in Health program, these clinics are open 7 days a week. There's a doctor at the clinic every single day and is on call 24 hours, 7 days a week. This particular photo that you see in front of you, we visited this community. Many of the people waiting online, which frankly looked a little bit like a Starbucks store with a line out the door, many of these people waiting online had walked hours to get to this clinic, even though this clinic is open every day of the week. It was a big crowd there. And so you can get I had a very strong sense of how important healthcare was and how important it was to the people who had walked to the clinic sick and walked home sick for hours. Clean water is another huge issue, and this is a project that Keurig Green Mountain helped fund. It was also put in place by the Engineers Without Borders with some of their assistance. It's the University of Vermont chapter. We got involved in this project. And this water is used not just for drinking, but farmers here used it for drip irrigation. These are coffee farmers who started growing tomatoes, and not just a few tomatoes, but about 18 acres of tomatoes that's now generating employment for 14 people year-round. And the farmers have an interesting approach to their businesses. They say that when we have a good year in tomatoes, we're going to take our earnings and invest it in our coffee. And when we have a good year in coffee, we're going to invest it in our tomatoes. And it seems to be working very well for this community. Of course, there are other diversification strategies. Many of them are very, very basic as having a few chickens who can produce eggs, both for the family's needs to eat for their nutrition, but also to sell into the local market. But then there was a woman who I want to introduce you to. Her name was Juana Valle. Juana lives in a community called El Coyular, Nicaragua. And she and her husband, Cesar, live at the very end of a dirt road that their home, like most of the other homes in the community, is very, very humble. Wooden plank, tin roof. They did have a cement floor. And they participated in the interviews with Seco Cafen. And they, like everyone else in the community, had 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food. Well, they got involved in Seco Cafen's we call it food security project, which is also focused on income diversification. And Juana, who was very entrepreneurial, started making marmalades from some of the fruits that were growing on her property. And she started selling these marmalades into the nearby village. And the first year, when we arrived, Juana and Cesar had about 2 hectares of coffee that looked horrible. It looked like the coffee looked like it hadn't been pruned in probably 4 or 5 years, and probably hadn't been fertilized in at least that long. But what they did was most of their coffee was in the shade. Some of their coffee was in the sun, and they planted fruit trees above the coffee in the sun. And less than 3 years later, Juana started harvesting fruit from these fruit trees. And again, during this period of time, she's continuing to grow her marmalade business. They planted a crop called achiote, which is used as a dye for clothing that also has market value in their local market. And finally, in 2012, I visited them, and I asked Juana what the most significant change was that had taken place on her farm over the past year. And she took me by the hand, literally, and led me through her coffee parcel to a field that had just been fallow. There had been nothing growing on this field. It was a gentle hillside. And when we arrived, this is what I saw. Juana had planted passion fruit. And you can see it was very carefully laid out with wooden stakes. There was wire overhead that connected all of the wooden stakes, and trained on the wire was passion fruit. I was stunned, and I asked her, I said, so Juana, what does this passion fruit mean to you and to your family? And she said, well, first of all, we harvest coffee just 3 months of the year. Our family, Cesar and Juana and their 4 children, they earned between $3,000 and $4,000 a year on their coffee, from their coffee, from which they had to, buy they needed that money to provide for everything that they owned, including their food. And she said, with passion fruit grows all year long. And she told me, she said, I'm not happy with the market price for passion fruit. But she said, right now, we're earning between $700 and $800 a month from passion fruit. More than twice what they were earning from their coffee. And she said, in addition to that, we've had to hire 3 people from our local community to help us with our passion fruit. Now she's generated employment for other families. So Juana and Cesar, it was interesting, I visited them this past March, and they told me, Cesar actually pulled me aside, and he said, Rick, we want to thank Keurig Green Mountain, we want to thank Seco Cafen for all of the assistance that you provided us, but the reality is we don't need Green Mountain anymore, we don't need Seco Cafen. We've graduated. And they'd graduated. Well, on the same trip in March, I visited some honey producers who were also doing very well, but then went on to a community called San Jeronimo in the department of Madriz in Nicaragua, in northern Nicaragua. And this is a community-based cooperative that belongs to a larger cooperative, fair trade cooperative called Protocoop. And I met with these farmers 4 years ago when we first started funding a very similar food security project that was focused on income diversification. And I remember asking them what their dream was for this food security project. And they said it was 2 things. They had two dreams. The first was to develop a seed bank where they could save the seeds that were important to them and their families. Seeds for vegetables that they liked to eat and that would do well in their microclimate. They said that the Nicaraguan government often provided free seeds, but oftentimes those seeds didn't grow well in this microclimate, and oftentimes they didn't grow food that the families really liked to eat. So here I was, this past March, 4 years later, and this same community, I should tell you, also we also worked with this community on helping cover some of the costs of a water project. When I visited one of the early years, I walked up the hillside with a family, 25 minutes, to where they collected water. They carried 2 plastic buckets, 25 minutes up the hill, twice a day to gather their water at the source where the water is the cleanest. And then they would return back later in the same day to collect it again. So, they were spending, close to 2 hours a day just gathering water for their family's needs. So anyway, we had a food security project in San Geronimo, and we also supported a water project. And here I was this past March meeting with the water committee, which is what this photo is here. And they gave a very, great report. The progress was great on the water project. And when they finished, I asked them about La Roya. Had their community cooperative been affected by La Roya? And this farmer told me that, yes, we've been affected by La Roya. He said 2 years ago, the cooperative harvested 2,000 quintales of coffee. Last year, they harvested 1,000 quintales of coffee. And this year, 300 quintales of coffee. It was a drop of 85%. 85%. And in my travels, I don't know how about your travels, but most of the range that I have run into was someplace between 20 and maybe 60, 65%. But 85% loss in yield and 85% loss in income from coffee was devastating. And so I could only in my mind think that many of the farmers must have migrated from this community. And so I asked, this man's name is Maximino, and I asked Maximino if farmers had left, had he lost many members of the co-op, migrated, and he said no. And I was stunned. I was taken back. I still didn't understand. He must have seen that I was stunned. And so he said, "Come with me." And we walked over to the other side of the co-op building, where we found 8 silos that were filled with corn and beans. The cooperative had set up a communal system for silos where the families had agreed that they would deliver all of their dried corn and dried beans and put them in these silos to store. And during the thin months, the families would draw off of these stored dried beans and corn to feed their families. And if there was any excess, together they would decide whether they would sell this corn and beans into the local market as another source of income. And there was excess. And then he said, "Follow me." We walked down the street, the main street in the village, and in front of every single home, there was a green piling, bright green piling about 4 feet high. And on top of that piling, there was a spigot that was delivering fresh, clean water to every house in this small community, about 40 homes. And he said, now the families they're saving time. They don't have to go gather their water every day, but they're also using this water not just to drink, they're using it to plant gardens. And I'm a vegetable gardener myself, but I was jealous. I would love to have gardens that were as lush and as productive as the gardens that I saw in San Geronimo. So here we were in a community that 4 years ago that was struggling with 3 to 4 months of extreme scarcity of food, that had to walk basically 2 hours a day to fetch clean water. And here they were now with an 85% drop in their coffee yield, and they weren't leaving. Families, fathers and sons were not leaving to go to do other work. They were actually better off today, even with that huge loss of income from coffee, than they were 4 years ago in terms of meeting their basic needs. So I think about that experience, that conversation I had, and I think about resilience. I think about how, if we can get and work with farming families to get them to a point where we have primed the pump. They don't want charity. But if we can get them to a point where they can provide for themselves, they have the wisdom and the knowledge to do that, and they know what strategies to use to become more resilient to the variety of shocks that they're facing. And it's not just the thin months, it's the impact of climate change, it's the impact of coffee pricing, it's the lack of access to credit and so on. They're very, very, very ingenious, and they've found ways to make things work for themselves and their family with just a little bit of support. This is what Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, my team, had invested in 2013, and the investments had basically touched about 837,000 people in Green Mountain's supply chain through investments in food security, economic development, health, education, water, and other investments. I want to leave you just with this quote. This is by a futurist, a nanotechnologist named Jaime Castillo. And I'll read it briefly to you, but he said, as we look ahead, we need to strive for an environment and a civilization able to handle unexpected changes without threatening to collapse. Such a world would be more than simply sustainable. It would be regenerative and diverse, relying on the capacity not only to absorb shocks like the popped housing bubble or rising sea levels, but to evolve with them. In a word, it would be resilient. Thank you very much.